Please, Selam. Do not do this. I will never forget the way Yohannes' voice cracked that evening under the acacia tree. The sun was setting behind the hills of our small village, Toba, painting everything in shades of orange and red. But nothing about that sunset felt beautiful. My sister, Selam, stood there, her hands trembling, her face a mix of sadness and determination. She had just told him the news: she was going to marry Demeke, the son of one of the wealthiest men in the village. It was arranged, finalized by our father over injera and honey wine just 2 days before. Yohannes, her childhood love, wasn't part of the plan anymore. I'm Abiba, Selam's younger sister. I'm the one who saw it all happen, every decision, every tear, every argument. I wish I could say it was an easy story to tell, but it's not. It's a story of love, tradition, and choices that can shape an entire life. And it starts right here, under this tree, with Yohannes' voice breaking and Selam looking like her heart was breaking too. It's not my choice, Selam whispered, but her words didn't comfort him. They didn't comfort me either. It didn't feel right, but in our village, you don't just go against what the elders decide. At least, that's what we were taught. I wish I could tell you this was the worst of it, but it wasn't. It was just the beginning. Let me take you back a little, so you can understand why Selam had to choose between the life she wanted and the life others thought was best for her. Selam and Yohannes grew up like two birds sharing the same branch. They were inseparable. Wherever Selam went, Yohannes was close behind. When the rains came and the fields turned green, they would run barefoot through the mud, laughing as if the world belonged only to them. When the dry season came, they would sit by the river, Yohannes weaving stories out of thin air, and Selam listening with stars in her eyes. Yohannes was not a rich man's son. His father was a potter, his mother a weaver. They worked hard, but their house was small, and their meals were simple. Yet, Yohannes had a way of making everything feel grand. He had dreams bigger than the hills that surrounded Toba. One day, Selam, he would say, I will build you a house on the hill, and we will see the sunrise together every morning. And Selam would laugh and tell him that she didn't need a big house, just him. But in Toba, love stories like theirs were fragile. They could be crushed by something as simple as a conversation between two fathers. It happened on a quiet Sunday. Father had just returned from the market when Demeke's father came to our house. I was sitting on the floor, playing with a wooden carving Yohannes had made for me. Selam was grinding coffee beans. The smell filled the air, rich and earthy. When Demeke's father arrived, everything changed. Demeke's family was one of the wealthiest in the village. They owned half the land and most of the cattle. When Demeke's father spoke, people listened. That day, he spoke to my father about marriage. Your daughter, Selam, is a fine young woman, he said. She would make a perfect wife for my son. Father didn't even hesitate. It would be an honor, he said, his voice steady. Selam froze. I saw the mortar in her hands tremble, and for a moment, I thought she might spill the coffee beans. But she said nothing. In our culture, daughters don't interrupt their fathers. That night, Selam didn't eat. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but I was just a little girl, and she was my older sister. Still, I couldn't stand the silence. Selam, I whispered. Are you okay? She turned to me and forced a smile. Yes, Abiba. Everything will be fine. But her eyes told a different story. They were red, like she had been crying. Yohannes found out 2 days later. He came to our house, his face bright with excitement. He had just sold some pottery at the market and wanted to share the news with Selam. But when he saw her face, his smile faded. What's wrong? He asked. Selam couldn't bring herself to say it, so I did. She's going to marry Demeke. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Yohannes' face fell, and for a moment, he looked like he might collapse. Is this true? He asked Selam. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. And that's when Yohannes said the words that I will never forget. Please, Selam. Do not do this. In our village, tradition is like the root of the acacia tree, deep, strong, and unyielding. From the moment a girl is born, her path is often set. Elders decide what is best, and to go against them is to risk shame, exile, or worse. Selam knew this. I knew this. But knowing didn't make it any easier. That week, our house was a flurry of preparation. Mother and the other women of the village gathered to discuss wedding plans. They talked about the feast, the dresses, the music. They didn't talk about Selam's silence, or how her laughter had disappeared. Yohannes didn't come to our house again. I heard whispers that he had stopped working in the market and was spending his days by the river. Some said he was waiting for Selam. Others said he was trying to forget her. I didn't know which was true. All I knew was that my sister was slipping away, piece by piece. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I followed Selam. She had been quiet all day, and something in her eyes told me she wasn't just going for a walk. She headed toward the river, her steps quick and purposeful. When I saw Yohannes waiting for her under the big sycamore tree, my heart raced. They were risking everything by meeting like this. If anyone found out, it would bring shame to our family and possibly worse for Yohannes. I had to see you, Yohannes said as Selam approached. His voice was raw, filled with a mix of desperation and hope. Yohannes, you shouldn't be here, Selam replied, looking around nervously. If anyone sees us. I don't care, he interrupted. I can't let you go without a fight. Selam, we can leave. We can go to another village, start over. Selam shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. I can't leave. My family, they need this. What about what you need? Yohannes stepped closer, his voice breaking. What about us? For a moment, Selam looked like she might say yes. But then she turned away, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered. I can't. I stayed hidden, watching as Yohannes fell to his knees, his hands clutching the grass. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry. It was the first time I truly understood how much he loved her, and how much she loved him. The next morning, word began to spread that Selam and Yohannes had been seen together by the river. I don't know who told the elders, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. By midday, the elders had gathered under the big baobab tree in the center of the village. Father was called to speak, and Selam was summoned to explain herself. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. Selam walked slowly, her head held high despite the whispers and accusing stares. Yohannes was nowhere to be seen. Selam, one of the elders began, his voice deep and commanding. Is it true that you have been meeting with Yohannes in secret? Selam's voice was steady when she replied, yes, it is true. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Father's face turned dark with anger, and I could see his fist clench at his sides. The elder raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. Do you deny that you are promised to Demeke? No, Selam said, her voice quieter now. I do not deny it. Then why would you disgrace your family by meeting with another man? The elder demanded. Selam's eyes filled with tears, but she stood her ground. Because I love him. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. It was the first time I had ever heard anyone in our village speak so openly about love, as if it were more important than tradition. The elders exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Finally, the eldest among them spoke. Selam, you have brought shame upon your family and disrespected our customs. There will be consequences. I wanted to scream, to beg them to stop, but I was just a little girl, and my voice didn't matter. Selam looked at me for a brief moment, her eyes soft and sad. Then she turned back to the elders and said, "Do what you must." That night, Yohannes came to our house. He didn't care about the whispers or the stares. He stood outside, calling Selam's name until Father came out, his face like a thunderstorm. "What do you want?" Father demanded. "I want Selam," Yohannes said. "I love her, and she loves me. Please, let us be together." Father laughed bitterly. Love. Love doesn't put food on the table. Love doesn't bring respect to this family. Demeke's family does. "I may not have wealth," Yohannes said, his voice steady. "But I have my hands, my heart, and my honor. I will work every day to give Selam the life she deserves." "And what life is that?" Father shot back. "A life of struggle. Of poverty." "No, Yohannes. Selam deserves better than you." "Let Selam decide," Yohannes said. "If she wants to marry Demeke, I will leave and never return. But if she chooses me, I will dedicate my life to making her happy." Father turned to Selam, who had been standing in the doorway, silent and still. "Well," he said. "What do you say?" Selam looked at Yohannes, then at Father, then at the ground. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "I don't know." Later that night, Mother came to Selam's room. I followed quietly, listening from just outside the door. Mother sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Selam," she said softly, "I know this is not easy." "What should I do, Mama?" Selam asked, her voice breaking. "If I marry Yohannes, I will shame our family. If I marry Demeke, I will lose myself." Mother sighed, her eyes full of sadness. "When I was your age, I had dreams too. But I chose the path that was expected of me. I won't tell you what to do, Selam. Only you can decide what will make you happy." Selam began to cry, and Mother held her close, whispering words I couldn't hear. I wanted to go in, to tell Selam to choose Yohannes, but I stayed where I was. This was her decision, and no one else's. The next morning, Selam stood before the elders once again. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. The entire village had gathered, waiting to hear her choice. "I have made my decision," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will not marry Demeke." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people shouted in anger, others in disbelief. Father's face turned red with fury, but Selam didn't falter. She turned to the elders and said, "I will not go against my heart." Yohannes stepped forward, his face filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Selam," he said, "are you sure?" She nodded. "Yes, Yohannes. I choose you." The silence after Selam's declaration was louder than the chaos before it. The elders looked at one another, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. Father's eyes burned with anger, but he said nothing. It was Mother who finally stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Selam has made her choice," she said. "And as her family, we must respect it." The crowd murmured, unsure of how to react. In our village, defying tradition was almost unheard of. But Mother's words carried weight. Slowly, people began to disperse, whispering to one another about what had just happened. Yohannes reached for Selam's hand, and she took it. For the first time in weeks, I saw her smile. It was small, but it was real. When we returned home, Father's anger exploded. He paced back and forth, his voice rising with every word. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he shouted at Selam. You've brought shame to this family. You've ruined our reputation. Selam stood her ground, her chin held high. I did what I had to do, she said. I chose my own happiness. Happiness. Father scoffed. Happiness doesn't put food on the table. Happiness doesn't bring respect. Mother stepped in then, placing a hand on Father's arm. Enough, she said softly. What's done is done. We need to move forward. Father shook his head, but he said no more. He retreated to his room, slamming the door behind him. The next few weeks were difficult. The whispers in the village didn't stop. Some people avoided our family altogether. But Yohannes and Selam didn't let it deter them. They began to build a life together, just as they had dreamed. Yohannes worked tirelessly, crafting pots and selling them in the market. Selam started a small garden behind their new home, growing vegetables and herbs. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that seemed to be enough. I visited them often, bringing small gifts from Mother and staying to help where I could. Seeing Selam smile again made me believe that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Not everyone in the village was against Selam and Yohannes. Some admired their courage, quietly supporting them from the sidelines. Others, however, were not so kind. Demeke's family, in particular, was furious. One day, Demeke himself came to Yohannes' workshop. I was there, helping Yohannes carry clay. Demeke's face was twisted with anger as he confronted Yohannes. You think you've won, he spat. You think you can just take what's mine. Yohannes didn't rise to the bait. He kept his voice steady. Selam is not something to be owned. She made her choice. Demeke's fist clenched, but he didn't strike. Instead, he turned to me. Tell your sister this isn't over, he said before storming off. I told Selam what had happened, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. But Yohannes took her hand and promised her that he would protect her, no matter what. Demeke's words were not idle. A few days later, someone destroyed the garden Selam had worked so hard to cultivate. The plants were trampled, the soil overturned. Selam found it early in the morning, and when I arrived, she was on her knees, trying to salvage what she could. Why would they do this? She whispered, her voice shaking. Yohannes knelt beside her, his hands gently covering hers. Because they want to scare us, he said. But we won't let them. We'll rebuild. And they did. With my help, and the quiet support of a few kind neighbors, the garden was replanted. It wasn't just about growing food anymore, it was a symbol of their resilience. The destruction of the garden didn't go unnoticed. The elders called a meeting to address the growing tension in the village. Yohannes and Selam were summoned, as was Demeke and his family. The council sat in a circle under the baobab tree, their faces serious. One of the elders spoke. This conflict is tearing our village apart. We must find a way to restore harmony. Demeke's father stood first. My son has been wronged, he said. Selam was promised to him, and this union was stolen from us. Yohannes stood next. Selam is not a prize to be won, he said. She is a person, with the right to choose her own path. The elders deliberated for hours, their voices low and serious. Finally, the eldest among them spoke. We cannot change what has happened, he said. But we can choose how we move forward. Yohannes and Selam have chosen each other. It is time for the rest of us to accept that and let go of the past. The decision didn't please everyone, but it brought a sense of closure. To celebrate, Yohannes and Selam decided to hold a small feast. They invited the entire village, hoping to mend some of the rifts that had formed. Mother and I helped with the preparations. We cooked for hours, filling the air with the rich smells of dorowort and fresh bread. When the evening came, people began to gather. Some came out of curiosity, others out of genuine support. Yohannes stood to speak, his voice clear and steady. We know that our choice has caused pain and division. But tonight, we want to focus on what brings us together. We want to thank those who have supported us and offer peace to those who have not. Selam took his hand, her eyes shining with tears. This is not just about us, she said. It's about the kind of future we want for our village. One where love and choice are respected. As the night went on, the tension began to fade. People ate, laughed, and even danced. For the first time in months, the village felt united. The feast marked a turning point. Slowly, the whispers and stares began to fade. Selam and Yohannes continued to build their life together, and their courage inspired others. Young girls began to speak more openly about their dreams, and parents started to listen. Even father, though still stern, seemed to soften. One evening, I saw him watching Selam and Yohannes as they walked in the garden. There was a hint of pride in his eyes, though he would never admit it. As for me, I learned something important from watching my sister's journey. I learned that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand up for what you believe in, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. Years later, Selam and Yohannes' story became a part of our village's history. People began to tell it as a lesson, not about defiance, but about love and the courage to choose your own path. The elders, too, began to change. They started to include younger voices in their discussions, recognizing that tradition should grow and adapt. And when a new couple stood before them, asking for their blessing, they no longer asked about wealth or status. They asked, "Do you love each other?" Selam and Yohannes proved that love could be stronger than tradition. And in doing so, they didn't just change their own lives, they changed the future of our village.